All right. Hey, everybody. How's it going today? Welcome to the Queer POTUS channel. We have an amazing live chat to do with you today. I have somehow managed to get Owen Symes to come here onto the channel, which is a great honor because Owen has just completed a fantastic book on Barack Obama and the history of the Obama years. It's called He Was Our Man in Washington. If you are watching this right now, you should probably go to the internet and get yourself a copy of this book because it is fantastic and it is very timely. So I want to start by congratulating you, Owen, on publishing this amazing book.
Thank you. It's kind of a weird feeling because it's such a slow process. It's kind of like, is it done yet? Like, it's a year to write, year to publish, like a year to produce or whatever. It's been very strange.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've been doing a lot of research on the Trump administration since he left office, and
doing the Lord's work.
There's just so much, and it's like, how would you even write a book about this story? But I thought, this book really goes through the Obama presidency issue by issue, and really gets to the heart of who this person was and what his policies were in a way that you just don't normally get from reading, for example, A Promised Land, his autobiography. You're not going to get that level of detail like you get in this book. So I wanted to start the conversation by asking you a pretty superficial question here, which is about the title of your book. And I wanted to know, the title of the book, He Was Our Man in Washington. So, and when I came across the origin of the title when I was reading the book, I was shocked. But I want to leave it to you to sort of answer this question any way you want. Who do you have in mind when you say he was our man in Washington?
Sure. Well, so the origin of the quote, just to spoil it, early in his administration, he met with some of the top financial executives in the country, and they were very trepidatious. This was in the middle of the Great Recession, and this was kind of an unknown guy. He'd only been a senator for a couple years, recently on the national stage. So they didn't really know what to expect for him. They were kind of hoping he was on their side, but they really weren't sure. Kind of like FDR, he campaigned on a platform of kind of everything for everybody and nothing at the same time. So trying to make everyone happy, which is politically very astute. So he gets into this meeting, and these bankers and financiers aren't really sure what to make of it. And he straight up tells them, I'm the only thing between you and the pitchforks, essentially. Like, I'm here to protect you. And so subsequent to that meeting, a journalist interviewed one of the participants, and he said, yeah, this was great. He's our man in Washington. And so when I read that, I was very struck by just how blatant that admission was. Obviously, other presidents have been better or worse, but it kind of comes with the office that you are kind of benefiting the ruling class more than anyone else. It's not like a radical position. Even if Bernie Sanders had been elected president, it wouldn't have been a radical presidency. It would have been better, but it wouldn't have been a real break, I don't think. That's difficult to accomplish when there's that kind of systemic inertia. So Obama comes in, there's a lot of progressive rhetoric and there's a lot of uncertainty. And he just very early in his term comes out and says whose side he's really on. And I guess compared to Trump, he's definitely better. There are gradations here, but fundamentally, cut from the same cloth. So that's pretty much who I meant by that. I wasn't trying to be cute with the title or anything like, oh, well, this is who the financier. Oh, but really he was on our side, or, he's, it was with the Martians or the Russians or whoever else. Like, no, it's the capitalists. That's who he's mostly for. He's not evil or malicious about it. It's not like he doesn't care about working people to a degree, but that's where his priority is with the capitalist class.
Yeah, I initially read the title and thought, oh, you were sarcastically saying like he was our man, as in us, the sort of left wing side of the political equation, like he was our guy. And then I came across the quote and I was like, oh, it was one of these financial people who actually said he's our man in Washington.
Yeah, and the title is funny because it kind of serves as a little bit of a test to see like how far did you actually read. because I can definitely see liberals picking up the book and thinking, oh, he's our man in Washington, it's positive. Or I can see conservatives picking it up and saying like, oh, this guy is pro-Obama, like it's a piece of trash book kind of thing. It's like, well, if you actually find the quote in the book, it gives you some indication of where the book is actually, coming from, I think.
I think also this picture of Obama kind of tells me it's not going to be super pro-Obama.
Yeah, that's actually, it's funny. In the production process, you're not allowed, at least with this publisher, that you weren't allowed to like choose your own cover. But they asked me to upload like basically stock photos, stock images, be like, hey, give us an idea of the kind of aesthetic you want to go for. And I sometimes I draw in my free time. So I was sketching some portraits of Obama, taking an hour here, an hour there, and doing a couple different ones. And I was messing around with one of the ones that I drew in like MS Paint or whatever. And I ended up with this image, and I thought, oh, this is kind of neat. Maybe I'll upload this because I'm not really finding any like stock images that I like. Right. And maybe they'll use that as like, a jumping off point. And then they just used the picture. I was like, oh, I would have worked harder on that if I knew you guys were going to actually use it on the front cover.
Yeah. I mean, it's very eye catching, and it's certainly...
I do like it for that. It catches your eye on the shelf. So
yeah. So in your introduction to the book, you talk about how you're looking through this history from the perspective of socialism, and you cite the War on Terror and the Great Recession as your influences for doing so. So can you explain a little bit what that means to you to do history from a socialist perspective?
Yeah, so I come from a more conservative background. I got my BA in history from Hillsdale College, which anyone that's from Michigan knows that's a bastion of traditional conservatism, Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman, all those hyphenated buzzwords. And so the nice thing about Hillsdale, as much as the administration was kind of trash, the teachers were very good. And I got a really good education and a good grounding in looking at primary sources and trying to deal with history on its own terms. And so even by the time I left college, I wasn't like a staunch conservative at that point. I was more like libertarian, I guess you could say. I had been given the opportunity to read Marx in a continental philosophy class. We read Alienated Labor, which was like pretty eye-opening for me. And, I read some Foucault and some Gadamer and some other guys. And I found that really compelling. So even within that conservative institution, I was already kind of, going off the beaten path a little bit. And then pretty apolitical up through most of Obama's second term. I was busy working. I worked at a for-profit psychiatric hospital, which kind of opened my eyes a little bit to, medicine for profit is not exactly good. That was a pretty interesting experience. Working in retail, same thing. You treat your employees like trash and you don't really feel like capitalism is working for you. And then when Trump got elected, I was just like kind of blown away, as I think a lot of more like liberal, left-leaning people were. And that really got me looking at what Obama actually did and like, how did we actually get here? And then, like I said in the introduction, by the time I was finished researching the Great Recession, I was pretty taken aback by the actual history of capitalist development. I think one of the reasons I hadn't really ever questioned that economic system is because it just came across as natural, as the way things have always been, or at the very least the way things ought to be, more or less, even with their flaws. And looking at the actual history of it and how it's so contingent on actual developments, how it's not a necessary, the necessary destiny of mankind or anything like that, just kind of opened my eyes to other, I guess, political persuasions. So when I talk about history from a socialist perspective, I guess the first thing is capitalism is not the only way of doing things. It's not the inevitable way of doing things. And then the second thing is a focus less on the powerful and more on everyone else. So a limitation of history, especially the further back you go and the more sparse the sources get, is you're very limited in who you're usually able to talk about. You talk about the Middle Ages. Those are, priestly chronicles or court documents, a royal charter, things like that. The Magna Carta is a great example of that. It talks a lot about the lords and their relationship to the king. It kind of leaves out a lot of other people, though. So, yeah, especially for modern history, where a lot of these documents are still available, I think it's important for the historian to look more at the mass of people and what they actually go through and what they actually do. Because otherwise, I think it gives you a very skewed perspective on the way things were and the way things ought to be. Because if you focus just on the powerful, then capitalism seems okay. Well, of course, the quote unquote best and brightest should rule from on high in some kind of, enlightened despotism kind of thing. But of course, if you're not from that class, you don't have that opportunity to get that high. That doesn't seem so nice anymore. So,
Right.
Yeah. And then just at a more like economic level, like we can talk about like the definition of socialism if you want, but that's kind of like a whole can of worms, I guess.
Yeah.
Very contentious.
No, that gives me a good sense. And especially when you talked about, when you started talking about the Magna Carta, it reminded me of how in your book, so each chapter in the book is dedicated to a different, I guess you could say, different issue that was important during the Obama years. And in some of the chapters, you start as far back as 2,000 years ago and take us all the way through the history up to the current moment when Obama takes office. What was behind that approach? How did that help you really get to the heart of the Obama years?
Yeah, so one of the annoying things I found in a lot of the books I was reading was there was a lack of historical perspective. So they were very narrowly focused on the preceding 2 or 3 generations, post World War II America, or really just American history. So not even talking about like anything in the world all that much. A great example of this, just kind of tangentially, is I don't know if you're familiar with the historian Will Durant. He wrote
Yes.
in the 30s to the 70s, give or take.
YouTube.
So yeah. So yeah. So, and like anyone else, he's got his limitations and eccentricities and biases and whatever. But I very much admire him. And one of the things he talks about in one of his Story of Civilization volumes is how, for most of human history, Europe has been kind of an abutment of Asia. It hasn't really been that important, and so it's always good to take a step back and look at because I think he says at one point, kind of hyperbolically, when China built the Great Wall, Rome ended up falling. Because it pushed the Huns towards Rome, and that kind of helped, collapse Rome. So that's kind of like a more hyperbolic example of the international nature of things and how far back some of these cause and effect chains can go. And so when I was writing my book, especially in the context of the level of historical ignorance in this country, and I include myself in that because, even though I got a good education in how to deal with historical sources and what have you, my narrative history of world events, even after getting a BA in history, was very limited, and especially in terms of like economic and socio-political history. So having learned all that through a year plus of research, I wanted to try and throw as much of that into the book as possible, because I think without that kind of broad overview of things, it's difficult for people to really see what the problem is. If you start the history of capitalism at the year like 1900 or the year 1800, it comes across as pretty good overall, I think, or at least you can make it seem that way. But the further back you go and the more varied historical experience gets, I think the more nuanced your conclusions can be.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And it comes across in the book. When you go through that journey and you come up to the Obama years, it's like you are less caught up in the day-to-day and the immediate reaction to Obama, the figure, and you're more able to see the broader history revealed and understand why decisions end up getting made the way they do when you understand what's behind it, what's the history that leads up to it. And I think that was a good way of getting into the Obama history without making it strictly about a character analysis of Obama, the human being himself, right? Yeah. Of course, there's a great book about Woodrow Wilson that Sigmund Freud wrote, which is all about his personality. But I like your approach much better when we're talking about history.
Yeah, especially with I actually just read a book that kind of explodes psychoanalysis as a way to look at the world medically. So it's funny that you bring up Freud. Just I think it's called The Making of an Illusion. It's really interesting, really well done. But yeah, I wasn't very interested in like a psychological analysis of an individual because I think that that's biography, first of all, which is a genre I don't didn't really particularly want to write. But I think a lot of times that devolves into either like a hagiography, a sanctifying, or a character assassination. And I wasn't interested in either of those things.
Right.
When I first started researching and I was trying to find just a general overview of the Obama administration, one of the books I came across, I forget what it was called, but it was basically like Obama is the worst president in history. It was kind of like that Dinesh D'Souza kind of vibe.
Mm.
I don't think it was by him, but it was by that kind of pseudo historian. And I definitely wanted to shy away from that, just looking at his role within the structures that he inhabited rather than what are the dark recesses of his mind that as a historian you shouldn't be looking at anyways, because you don't know, right?
Right, exactly. So let's actually start getting into the actual meat of the Obama history here. I want to start by talking about Obama's first few months in office. So obviously there's this overwhelming sense of joy that George W. Bush is going back to the ranch. And there's this excited fascination with the new guy who's coming in, this person who up to a year before he was actually the president. I mean, I didn't even know his name. And suddenly he's our president. So there's this big fascination. There's a lot of hope. But there's this financial crisis that takes place. And it really ramps up leading into Obama's inauguration. So how does Obama initially view the financial crisis? And who does he hold responsible? What's his plan of attack here?
Sure. So Obama comes at a lot of this stuff from what's typically called the neoliberal perspective. So neoliberal being, the Milton Friedmans of the world. They're coming at it they're trying to re-embrace what they see as the classical liberal tradition. So they're the new liberals. They're not like the corrupted liberals, like the New Deal people. And the basic idea is if you let markets do their own thing with as little regulation as possible, then on balance, things will be better. That kind of market equilibrium will take hold. And, there will be some bumps here and there, obviously, as things change, but leave it alone, it'll figure itself out. And so when Obama came in, he was kind of inheriting that worldview, but at the same time, there was also a little bit more impetus for government intervention. Like there was some understanding that whoever the culprits were, things were a mess right now. And at least for a brief time, the government has to step in and play, crisis manager. His Secretary of Treasury, Timothy Geithner, constantly talks about it in terms of a military intervention or a medical emergency. And so it's an intervention it's necessary. It's not pretty. No one likes the fact that it has to be done. We don't want to do this forever. But for this moment right here, we got to get it done. We got to get the economy back on track. And so the Obama administration, the president and his Treasury Secretary and most of his economic advisors, they put most of the blame on a kind of a manic overconfidence, which is a hearkening back to John Maynard Keynes from the 1930s. The basic idea being, although group psychology dictates a lot of economic decision-making, investors still have a lot of individual power. And they'll make decisions often based on their individual psychology, what they think is good or bad, what they're confident in versus not confident in. And so you have to take that into account when you're making economic policy. And so from Obama's perspective, the investor class was freaking the heck out. And that came from a number of sources, talking about the housing bubble and how people had kind of got too ramped up in that, things of that nature. But his plan of attack was basically, let's try and stabilize things. That the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, had done a fair bit to make sure that some of these systemically important institutions, the things that were too big to fail, had been taken care of. So the government, what do they call those hybrid institutions? Those government entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the Bush administration made sure they were okay. Citigroup, they gave them money. So when Obama came in, it was mostly about AIG, the insurance conglomerate. And what had happened over the previous couple of decades was they had expanded their business model to include a whole lot of investing that you wouldn't have thought an insurance company would be involved in.
Right.
So a lot of the details are always murky because I don't use this on a daily basis, but like mortgage-backed securities and things like that, trying to make money out of existing debt. So one of the trends of the last 50 years or so has been there's less innovation in actual goods and services because that's difficult and requires investing time and money, and more in innovating ways to make money on existing stuff, especially debt. So trying to make money off of that. And this stuff is all kind of arcane to me because I'm not an economist and I don't really get, I get to a degree how you would do it, but on the detail level, it never made that much sense to me. Like, how do you make money off of someone else's debt? It just seems so counterintuitive based on everyday experience. But that was the idea. And so this caused a speculation bubble, as often happens with capitalism. You can look at the Florida real estate bubble of the 1920s. That was part of the general stock market, fever at that time, or the savings and loan crisis, or the dot-com bubble. Like whatever it is, this kind of fervent overconfidence, things are always going to keep getting better. The housing market is going to keep going up. The housing prices are going to keep going up. I can keep, remodeling and selling a house and buying a new one and flipping it and whatever. So the Obama administration wanted to slow all that down, make sure that people were confident in the economy again, and get the circulation of credit going. There was a lot of emphasis on credit. Because when these banking institutions were freaking out, they were like, whoa, we don't want to lend money to people because we need the money to pay off our own debts. And the Obama administration was like, okay, but you have to lend money for the economy to keep moving. Now, that's kind of the lifeblood of everything. We don't want to have an economic heart attack and just fall apart. We don't want that kind of stagnation, because when that happens, then the government needs to step in and actually do things. And we don't want that either. We want you guys to do it on your own, maybe with government money, but you're the expert, so you do it, which is laughable because these experts got them into that problem in the first place, which is kind of weird. Mm-hmm. It's funny how that works. But the Obama administration had faith that these financial guys could get the job done if they were given the chance, given some breathing room, given some money to hold them over, right? And so that's what the Obama administration did. They bailed out AIG, they bailed out the automakers, quite controversially, I might add. At the time, people were pretty angry about that. And the emphasis was, let's get the big pieces of the economy going, and then the rest will take care of itself, which is a very neoliberal outlook.
I think the one thing that really struck me was this idea that it was like a war, and that the important thing was to keep the country from crashing by getting money to these certain institutions so that they could remain solvent. And in some ways, like, I study Abraham Lincoln a lot, and it kind of reminded me of Abraham Lincoln when he became president. There was this big sort of like, because the secession crisis was taking place, he had one side of in one of his ears, people were screaming, compromise at all costs. In the other ear, he had, let's go, now's the time to like abolish slavery. And he ended up, viewing his role as sort of like, my job is to keep the ship of state moving. And he was willing to make compromises in all directions to do that. What he didn't have was a neoliberal outlook. That didn't exist yet.
Yep. I think there was a more of an understanding that government, had things that it needed to do directly to benefit people. Now that's controversial because obviously one of the things that Lincoln signed into law was the Homestead Acts, which benefited a lot of people at the expense of the indigenous inhabitants. I guess that's so it's definitely a mixed legacy in that sense. But you're right, Lincoln didn't have that kind of intellectual baggage that the Obama administration was saddled with, and this has been going on since at least the Reagan years, if not earlier. Jimmy Carter might have been the first neoliberal. Yeah. That's definitely arguable. But yeah, there's this strange idea that these corporations are sacrosanct, and that as much as possible, the government needs to keep hands off, even though these corporations are often larger than state governments and have more of an impact globally. I mean, AIG had a global impact, but somehow they're still a private institution, and it's very strange to me. Doesn't really make that much sense, which maybe means I just have to read more of what they're saying to get it. But just this idea that, private institution does something publicly, so we'll help them out when they're in trouble, but they can do what they want otherwise, even if it doesn't actually benefit people.
Yeah. So I want to take us out of the top tiers of power and go a little bit more into the people side of things. And you were mentioning how there was anger about the bailouts and all of that. So you talk about two grassroots movements that come into existence during Obama's term, and especially after this first 100 days of Obama's presidency that really starts ramping up. One is on the left, and that's Occupy Wall Street, and the other is on the right, and that's the Tea Party. So I was wondering if you could talk about which movement do you feel was more successful in achieving its aims ultimately? And if it's the Tea Party, does the left have something to learn from them?
It's an interesting question. I wish I'd focused a little bit, or at least devoted a little more time to them. They have small sections each in the book, but my sense really has been that the Tea Party has been the more successful of the two. Now that might be because they're still riding the prevailing political sails. It's not like they're really all that radical. What the Tea Party wanted was just a more extreme version of neoliberalism. It's within the bounds of acceptable discourse in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So it might just be that they had less political bulwarks to overcome in that way. And also, like, their success on a purely electoral basis was somewhat limited, right? The Tea Party caucus collapsed after a couple of years due to, more Republican primaries beating them, and they weren't actually able to do that much legislatively, partly because of a lack of experience. I think a lot of them are pretty green politically, but partly because they didn't really have all that much to offer as a legislative package. It was more just about stopping Obama from doing what he wanted to do, which, I mean, hey, if that's your bag, then they were a huge success. They helped block a lot of stuff one way or the other. But it's also easy, I think, a little bit too easy to crap on Occupy Wall Street. They got a lot of flack at the time, for not having a coherent ideology, a coherent strategy, or whatever. But when you don't have as much corporate funding as I think the Tea Party did, it's a lot easier to be a little more disorganized and disparate. And the left hadn't really been organized in any meaningful way for like a generation. So it was kind of a learning experience, I think, for a lot of these people that ultimately ended up doing a lot of good, helping form or helping inspire at least the organization of Black Lives Matter, getting people used to organizing again, to protesting on the streets. And we have seen in the last 5 or 10 years a huge uptick in left-leaning protests for all kinds of reasons. So I didn't read a whole lot of scholarship about it, but it wouldn't surprise me if that ultimately led back to the legacy of the Occupy movement and the kind of things that inspired. So short term, Tea Party, I think, definitely had more of an effect, more of a success in their eyes. Long term, that's yet to be determined. Maybe Occupy actually got the ball rolling on something more substantial.
Yeah, I think you're right when you kind of when you're talking about a protest against the existing order, and you have one side that can coexist with neoliberalism. They can aesthetically on the outside ostensibly succeed in ways that Occupy Wall Street wouldn't. Occupy or other left-wing movements have to really go the distance to succeed. Otherwise, because they don't work within the neoliberal framework.
Yeah, I mean, you can make a similar comparison with, say, anarchist radicals in the 1920s versus the KKK. Like, they were both relatively outside the political mainstream as far as like the liberal establishment was concerned. And yet, plenty of KKK guys were also police officers, and so that kind of gives you a leg up, I think, when you're doing political things. If you have at least some of the cops on your side, depending on where you are. So.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about the police soon. But I wanted to turn to foreign policy first. Now, I remember when Obama ran in 2008, and I was very excited about him. I voted for him. I was excited that Guantanamo Bay was going to close on day one.
The halcyon days.
2 horrible wars of the Bush years were going to end. And yet, reading your book and also just having lived it, one gets the sense that Obama did not really change much of the Bush foreign policy, but actually kind of he kind of helped those policies conform to the rule of law. So can you talk a little bit about Obama's efforts to legalize the war on terror?
Yeah, so it's kind of striking when we talk about Trump because people compare him to Bush, like Bush was some kind of paragon of virtue or like a normal president, whatever normal means. But if you actually go back and look at the Bush administration, so much of what they did was just seat of their pants, illegal, borderline unconstitutional. I mean, and that's a word that the meeting depends on who has power, but you could make an argument that a lot of what they're doing is pretty unconstitutional, and very in keeping with the kind of imperial presidency that Nixon tried to foist on people before Watergate kind of took him down, basically by accident. And the Bush administration had this doctrine of basically unimpeachable executive authority in the realm of war fighting. So even though Congress had never declared war on terrorists, because that's kind of dumb. You're declaring war on a tactic. It's kind of nonsensical. But Bush declared it, and because Bush is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, in his mind and in the mind of his sycophantic lawyers, that gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. So he goes gallivanting around the cosmos, stirring all kinds of trouble, starting several brutal wars. And the legacy of that is just so mind-boggling when you actually sit down to look at the results of it and just how far-flung this conflict has gotten. I mean, I was looking through the list of countries I talk about in the book, and it doesn't even include anywhere near all the countries that were affected. There's a war on terror going on in the Philippines and other African countries I didn't mention. This keeps spreading like this cancerous tumor, and that's Bush. He did that. So when Obama came in, I suspect he didn't really realize how far-reaching it was because so much of this is secret. And not really privy to public accountability, which in and of itself should worry conservatives to no end, but somehow it doesn't. I think that's kind of telling them where their priorities are. But so Obama comes in, and you could see some of this in his campaign rhetoric. He didn't criticize surveillance specifically because it was bad or a violation of civil liberties that shouldn't be violated. He criticized it because he thought it was illegal. And so one of his priorities was, let's take the stuff from the Bush years, kind of pull back on what was a little bit too crazy or grandiose, and legalize the stuff that we want to keep doing. Because ultimately, this is still worth fighting. Al-Qaeda and those guys are still our enemies. We have to defeat them. That's just a given. At no point did Obama, even as far as I'm aware, question the need to fight the war on terror and how can we extricate ourselves from this ridiculous conflict. So in keeping with that, he signed, I think the one I talk about specifically in the book was an extension of the Patriot Act sunset provisions in 2011. So the way a lot of legislation works, for anyone that doesn't know, is sometimes as a compromise, people will include aspects of a bill that will expire at a given period. And so there were sections of the Patriot Act, which had been signed right after 9/11 and gave the government all kinds of sweeping powers, to surveil the American people and the people of the world. And Bush went even farther than those stipulated powers, which just kind of shows you how committed he was to doing whatever he wanted. But there were certain provisions in the Patriot Act that were set to expire. And so Obama signed those into law. He gave them the okay. So his basic idea was, let's keep fighting the war on terror, but do it on a more solid legal footing, which makes sense. He's a lawyer by training and by disposition. It's not exactly a terrible way to look at the world, but it certainly has its limitations. And one of those was not asking those kinds of fundamental questions. If you're a lawyer, you're not really asking, should we have a criminal justice system? You just kind of assume because that's your bread and butter. So I think it was the same with Obama in that respect. And so, yeah, he ended up, he kept fighting it. The tactics were a little bit different. He didn't rely so much on shock and awe, invasions, because as it turns out, those are difficult, time-consuming, and costly. So he relied more on special operations, drone campaigns. I think in 2014, the commander of SOCOM, so the Special Operations Command, literally said that this is a golden age for special operations. SOCOM is now bigger than the military of the UK, It's
Mm.
a real gargantuan enterprise at this point, and we have no idea what they do most of the time because it's secret by nature. So that should worry a lot of people, I think.
So do you think Obama, is it fair to say Obama saved the war on terror, he expanded the war on terror, he legalized the war on terror, or he contracted it to some degree?
I think he definitely expanded it. Maybe not so much in terms of depth, like the number of troops obviously decreased, but in terms of breadth, he really increased it, especially in Africa, which strikingly, very few people that I really saw talked about very much. And because so much of it is special operations, at least I had a hard time finding a lot of information about it. But the information I did come across talked a lot about drastic increases in military operations of a small scale, but still obviously deadly. Trading a lot of local proxies. This goes back at least as far as Nixon. The idea that you want, like, troops are expensive. As Nixon found out with Vietnam, we don't like using our own troops for things. Let's use other people's troops. So just like Vietnamization in the early 70s, the idea in Africa, let's not get involved in another quagmire. We'll train Malian troops or we'll train Nigerian troops. They'll do the fighting for us, protecting themselves ostensibly. And you can argue one way or the other about that. But let's not use our own troops. We'll just give them money and equipment and training. And so that expanded drastically under Obama. The drone campaign expanded drastically. And I think that would have happened under any president. Like, it's not like Obama is particularly evil in this regard or something. The war on terror would have expanded under McCain too, I'm sure, or Romney.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it was nice that Obama had the disposition to try and make things at least a little bit more legal and transparent. But even within that, there are still limitations because all this special ops stuff is done within the purview of the executive office, and the transparency only goes as far as the resolution desk, right? So Obama made it clear that he thought he was doing his due diligence to make sure that the correct targets were chosen, the right people were killed. But as the citizens of the United States, we have no way of knowing that. We can't check that against anything, So it's that kind of unaccountable power that, again, I think people should be really worried about. And I don't know, they don't really seem to be. If who we elect is any indication, because they keep expanding it. It's not like we've elected a president that's curtailed executive power. Like, when's the last time that happened?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. So one thing I was surprised about in reading the book, because I've had a kind of negative opinion of Obama for a little while, and I'm starting to try to be a little bit more, not for Obama's sake, but for the sake of just understanding history better, be a little bit more open to understanding the realities of what was going on and not make it all about him specifically. But one thing that I was kind of surprised to read about was that Obama's record on the prison industrial complex. You mentioned that there's this amazing statistic in there that he released more people from prison than all the presidents before him combined.
Yeah, I don't know if it was all of them or like all from like the 20th century, whatever the stat was. Yeah, it was a substantial number of people. I think it was slightly less than 1,000.
Yeah,
which is a lot for presidential commutations. Obviously, in the grand scheme of number of people held in federal prison or number of people incarcerated due to the war on drugs, is a drop in the bucket.
right.
But I thought it was worth mentioning just because, like, it's not like again, I don't think Obama is a bad person. I think he meant well in a lot of ways. I think he empathized with individual victims or what have you, and so to a degree did what he could, quote unquote, to kind of foster at least semi-progressive objectives. But historical inertia, the nature of the office, and kind of his other beliefs that contradicted with his more progressive tendencies, kind of stymied a lot of that. So even though he did commute a lot of nonviolent drug offender sentences, he also didn't really do much else about police violence. He did more than other presidents have in the sense of empathizing with victims. He talked about how, I think he said that he could have been Trayvon Martin at one point. When he was a young kid, he could have been shot the same way. So it's like, hey, fair play to him. That's something that pretty much only the first black president could have said. And he got a shitload of flack for it, which I think is one of the reasons why he shied away from racial issues for a good chunk of his presidency, because he didn't want to be seen as like Black America's president. He wanted to be seen as the president of America, which is understandable. I don't really know how you thread that needle anyway. That works out well. But even with that caveat, he really didn't do much at all to try and ameliorate the plight of poor and particularly people of color in dealing with the police until very late in his presidency. And even then, it was mostly about information gathering, which is important. It's not like that's not important, because one of the problems with studying police brutality is the paucity of information. When people talk about the number of fatalities from police officers, those numbers are very hard to come by because different departments count things in different ways. They classify things in different ways. The information isn't reported. So having some federal standards for actually getting that information is incredibly important, but it's certainly not nearly enough. And I think it's fair to criticize Obama for having not tried to do more in that regard. Because if he had tried to do something and it failed legislatively, like, okay, you can talk about maybe he could have been more effective at realpolitik, but at least he made the effort. But he didn't even try, as far as I'm aware. Maybe he'll talk about that in the next, volume of his memoirs and try and make some excuses there. And that'll be interesting to read because, again, one of the limitations of this book is that it's so new. Like, it's not like I was looking through archives and things like that. So the limitations of the research could definitely sway, some of the conclusions I draw as time progresses. But based on the research I did, he didn't try nearly hard enough in that regard, especially with police brutality.
Yeah, when he talks about austerity in his book, in A Promised Land, his autobiography, you really get the sense that he really did obsess over sort of quote unquote reestablishing America's credibility abroad, and that he was on board with the idea that you have to tighten your belts at home because our credit is very important to all Americans. And he's fully he makes several caveats in his book where he goes on a tangent about specifically credit, the United States credit, and why austerity is important, and also complaining about why leftists ruined everything for him because they kept complaining about it when he was doing some kind of big strategy, big picture thinking. And it just kind of strikes me as a little bit out of touch with the realities. But
yeah, and that goes back to, when you focus on the powerful, that's the kind of garbage you end up talking about. So, and Hillary Clinton ran into the same problem when she ran for president. She seems so out of touch and so elitist, and this is a problem lots of Democrats have. So it's like, look, in the grand scheme of things, does the U.S. credit rating matter? I guess. But for a lot of working class Americans, they could care less. And unless you're dealing with those bread and butter issues, America's standing abroad doesn't really matter. Like, because if, as a government, if you're not facilitating a good life for all your citizens, then why bother being powerful at all? That's just power for its own sake. And that's, I think, pretty despicable. So,
yeah. So, in the conclusion of your book, yes, I see a comment here. Pokemon go to the polls. Exactly. So in the conclusion of your book, you talk a lot about the gains that were made by grassroots organizations.
Uh-oh, did we lose you, or is my internet fucking up?
Yeah. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. It happens.
Thanks, okay. Obama. Oh.
Yeah. Thanks, Biden, I guess we'll have to say now. But this question actually is going to be about Biden. So you talk about how DSA participation goes up during Trump administration period. You talk about how there's a growing interest in socialism as a politically viable alternative to the current system during Trump, as a reaction to Trump. But you go on to say, and I quote, you say, what this country needs is not another Obama, another nice guy that does mean things behind closed doors to benefit his corporate allies. So I'm wondering, A, can you unpack that a little bit? And B, do you think that Biden is another nice guy with corporate allies? And if so, have we not learned our lesson from the Obama years?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, Obama stabilized the status quo as best he could, kind of with the status quo kicking and screaming a little bit, from the right wing. But ultimately, he stymied a lot of progressive activism and tried to push things back to the Clinton years. So I think my point there is if we keep trying to do that, we're going to keep getting Trumps, because one of the kind of results of the Clinton years as an addendum to the Reagan years, and therefore as part of the whole neoliberal project, is a continued widening of economic inequality. And with that comes a destruction of what little democracy we actually had in the first place, because if you don't have economic power, you don't have political power. That's just kind of fundamental to human existence. Especially in a capitalist society, those who have the money make the decisions. And if you take money away from the masses of people, they're not going to be able to make decisions. So if we just keep trying to go back to those neoliberal years of success at the top and increasing rotting underneath, they're just going to fall apart all the more. And so I definitely think that Biden is a less effective version of Obama, or at least a less admirable version. Maybe he'll be more effective because he's more conservative. But so he's still trying to do the same thing. Now, he said, I think I read in an interview of his that he specifically said he didn't want to go back to the Obama years. I think an interviewer had said, oh, you're just trying to go back to Obama. And he was very clear, like, no, I don't want to do that. But I think he was just trying to strike out on his own a little bit. Like he didn't want to live under Obama's shadow. But I think fundamentally that's what he wants to do, that return to normalcy. Well, what's the normal that everyone wants to return to? I think liberals would like to see more presidents like Obama, very well-spoken, very articulate. I haven't gotten a chance to read his memoir yet because it didn't come out during my research, but I get the impression that it's pretty well written. It's okay, especially for a political memoir, right?
It's a political memoir, yeah.
The bar is low.
Exactly.
Most presidents are not Lincoln, gifted like that.
Unfortunately, never had a chance to write a political memoir.
True, that would have been fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, so more presidents like Obama, very articulate, empathetic, but also high-minded and America first. Less presidents like Trump, very knuckle dragging, can't complete a sentence, lowest common denominator appealing kind of thing. So there's this kind of elitist democratic tendency, liberal tendency, which is only going to run them into more problems. Because if you don't tether your elitism with actual economic gains for your electoral base, you're not going to get voted into office. Because that's what FDR, I think, ultimately knew. Because he was elitist all get out. He was super rich. He didn't care a lick about poor people, I don't think. But he understood that if you don't give them things, they're not going to vote for you. Right. And there's that kind of dirty aspect of politics that, it makes sense. I'm not going to vote for you if you don't give me something I need. Why should I go to the polls in that case? Right. And I think if Democrats continue down this road, the electorate is only going to get smaller because Republicans are going to keep trying to curtail voting rights. And the Democrats are going to end up, middle of the road in themselves out of political viability. Or they're going to turn so far right, as I guess you could argue they've already done, that they're indistinguishable from the Republicans. Because that's kind of Biden. I mean, if you didn't tell me which party Biden was from, I might not be able to distinguish it, given his record. So, except on issues like gay marriage, he's basically a Republican, as far as I can tell. So yeah, the more we get of those kind of milquetoast liberals, I think the worse things are going to get. How you fix that? I'm not sure you can within the realm of electoral politics. I think you have to work outside that. Vote for the lesser of two evils if you have to, but FDR didn't do good things because he wanted to. He did them because he thought he had to, and he thought he had to because of a militant labor movement and organized lower classes and things like that. So if we don't have that, then our political leaders aren't going to do anything.
Right.
I don't think.
And it's the same lesson from Lincoln's time as well. He's trying his damnedest to avoid having to emancipate the slaves. He would love to compensate slaveholders. He would love to graduate the societies off of slavery. He does not want to do the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yep.
And ultimately, he is pushed to do it. And
it's military necessity. Yep.
Yep. It's a lesson for us all.
Yeah. Now, I will say that it is important to have receptive politicians like Charles Sumner. Reading about Reconstruction, I was very struck by how little I knew about Charles Sumner, but how freaking awesome he was within the context of his time. Very outspoken on some issues that would make him a progressive into the 20th century even. So it's good to have those electoral allies, but we definitely can't rely on that as our only avenue, I think.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all. Owen, I want to thank you so much for coming in today to talk to us about Barack Obama, about his legacy and this history. I want to remind everyone to immediately go to the polls. Go to the internet and purchase. What's your preferred link again for, as opposed to Amazon?
Yeah, it's IndieBound.
IndieBound.
Yeah, so they try and partner with local bookstores, and get copies that way. Obviously, Amazon is kind of the buyer of last resort. Some people have to buy from there. That's fine.
Right.
We all live inside capitalism. So, just because you use money doesn't mean you're a hypocrite. Like you have to live. So. Yeah.
So whatever way you decide to do it, definitely go out and purchase this book, because whatever side of the somebody just asked, is this a conservative podcast? Are you guys on the right side? Okay. Well, it doesn't really matter what side we're on. You should buy this book no matter what side you're on, because it is illuminating and you can really start to get outside of the mystification of Obama and start to actually look at what was done in those years. And so I highly recommend that you get this book. And I thank you so much, Owen, for coming here today and talking to us about Obama.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
All right, folks. Well, thanks for coming. If you missed the beginning part of the video, you can go on YouTube. It should be up fairly soon, and you can start it all from the beginning. But thanks for coming, and we will see you soon. And check in with my channel next Wednesday for a new video. Talk to you later.